everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in, and a very big welcome to this first episode of Risk Rewired, the energy dispute podcast from Burgess Salmon. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be delving into all things relating to energy disputes. We're going to be joined by experts from our energy team, as well as some of the leading industry professionals. And together, we're all going to be looking at the life cycle of an energy project, exploring how and why disputes arise, and also looking at some of the options for mitigating and avoiding risk. My name is Jess Evans, and I'm a partner in Burgess Salmon's fabulous energy team, where I focus on construction and engineering disputes, and I am your host for today's episode. So in today's episode, we are looking at the inception of an energy project, and specifically what we're going to look at is some of the key issues that crop up during the project negotiations, as well as how to go about identifying solutions for mitigating risk at that very early stage. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues from the transactional energy team. We have Laura Sharples, who is a director in the energy construction team, and Alec, who is a partner in the energy projects team. They've each acted on dozens and dozens of energy deals involving a whole host of different technologies. So they really are seasoned experts when it comes to identifying practical solutions for managing risks at the outset of a project. Laura, Alec, welcome to you both. So, Risk Rewired, it's the energy dispute podcast, but of course, neither of you are actually dispute lawyers. Do you want to start by telling us a bit about your particular practice areas and also what's keeping you busy at the moment? Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I focus on the negotiation of construction and maintenance contracts for energy projects. So that's net zero, a lot of battery, solar, but also energy from waste, biofuels, etc.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, so plenty going on there, lots to keep you busy. And Alec?
Thanks very much, Jess. So I'm an energy project partner who specialises in the offtake arrangements for energy assets, so sort of sale of power, route to market agreements, power purchase agreements, but also the regulation and monetisation of energy assets generally. So that includes networks, electricity supply companies, major energy users, and sort of helping clients across the energy sector put in place contractual arrangements to monetise their assets or manage their energy risks.
Great, thank you both. We clearly are in good hands today. So this is our first episode of Risk Rewired. We are concentrating on energy project negotiations, and that seems to be a pretty good place to start when we're looking at options for mitigating risk. Alec, perhaps if I come to you first, and then maybe Laura can feed in. In your experience, what are the most sort of common risks that parties focus on during their energy project negotiations, and what do you do in terms of sort of supporting your clients to resolve them?
That's a really good question, and a tricky one to answer. I think from my perspective, obviously, part of the analysis around what the likely issues will be is slightly technology contingent on what that project relates to. So sort of, is it fueled? Is it not fueled? What is it going to do in the future? But I think a general theme that runs through all of the contracts that I typically advise on are certain key issues that will always be debated and that will flow right through the supply chain. And those kind of I would classify as delay. So we will all want the project to come online by a certain time, and that can be for lots of reasons, but particularly where there might be a revenue floor for a battery project, for instance, or another energy project, and or there is a fixed price for the output of a project from a set date, and or the generator has got a contract for difference that might kick in by a certain date. One of the issues that will always arise is, well, what happens if they're late? How does that flow through and affect the project economics? And therefore, how does that risk get flowed down to the extent possible in the construction documents? And then linked to that, and I think Laura might cover this on in a bit more detail, is force majeure. In what risks is each party taking on with regards to force majeure? Do they get extension rights or not? And how does that flow through the contracts? I think the next one sort of is commissioning requirements and the design of the project. So what under the offtake contracts, for instance, does the project need to be able to do in order for it to hit the commercial operations requirements in that offtake contract and accrue either the fixed price or the revenue floor, or effectively the full benefit of that offtake contract. Now, that will be very specific to the type of project and its technology, but there is a lot of risk around the interface between the two contracts and making sure that they talk to each other. So that's sort of EPC construction as against offtake contracts. And also around the fact that everyone is aligned on what that project should be doing. Now, that might seem like a trite comment, but in relation to solar and wind, it is more obviously aligned. But for new and more emerging technologies such as batteries or waste to energy projects or other waste to PX projects, etc., there is a much greater importance in terms of what we're expecting that project to be able to do and the product that it is going to deliver. So another good example might be SAF and sort of those projects and the refinement of the fuel and the grade of fuel that's going to be produced and the volumes.
I'm sorry, Alec, sorry, I'm interrupting you immediately. Can you just remind me and also our listeners what we're talking about when we talk about SAF?
Yeah, apologies. 3-letter acronyms are a bane of this industry. SAF means Sustainable Aviation Fuel. And is an area that others within the energy projects team are doing an awful lot of work on at the moment, and it is a key area of government policy interest. But around that, what is coming to the fore is effectively trying to make sure that people are happy not just with when the project is going to be operational and what we need for it to be operational, classified as operational under the contracts, but also effectively long term what it's going to do. Because if there is a gap there, that can have quite material issues separate to what I'm going to come on to, which is around things like performance availability and performance guarantees. So then the next point is then performance guarantees and performance availability. So commonly we will have in any offtake contract a concept of a liquidated damages regime around effectively the availability of that energy asset to either generate electricity or produce sustainable aviation fuel or produce heat, whatever the energy product that is intended to be produced by the generation asset, there will be the off-taker will want some sort of certainty or comfort that that asset is going to produce over the long term a sufficient volume of the required product to reflect how it is priced that contract. And if there is a shortfall, that will commonly be dealt with via in the short term, potentially some imbalance payments, but kind of longer term, there will usually be principles within the contracts dealing with effectively liquidated damages or compensation to top up the off-taker for the lost product it would have got if the generation asset was fully performing. And equally, that will then flow down into the construction contracts and be a key area of sort of negotiation and interface risk. And then the final one for me, and apologies, I've been talking too long, is change in law. And sort of, I think that's one of the common areas at the moment that we are really discovering, particularly in the energy sector in Great Britain, mainly because of the constant and evolving regime from a regulatory perspective. We have got numerous reforms being proposed to grid connections, and actually as a result of REMA, so the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, the kind of the complete review of markets in Great Britain and how the electricity market in Great Britain works, that is leading to a lot more contemplation of change in law clauses and crudely, and borrowing from Donald Rumsfeld, dealing with the known unknowns and also the unknown unknowns and allocating those risks between the parties, because it is incredibly important for both the developers but also limited recourse funders who are starting to ask questions around this and probe the certainty of those projects.
Thank you, Alex. It's really interesting in terms of the points that you see as going to be key. Do you feel that your clients and you are aligned in terms of what they anticipate are going to be the risks, or is there frequently sort of an education piece for both sides? So clients saying, yeah, but this is the commercial points which lawyers need to be very aware of in a drafting, and this is the legal points that you're then sort of turning to the clients for.
I would say in most cases, clients and lawyers are typically aligned, but what we are seeing, and sort of we'll trying to reflect that in the drafting, but what we are seeing is the continually evolving picture of that kind of the regulatory change, and therefore it is a really live topic in terms of changing the drafting or changing that risk allocation. And the other thing that we're seeing is just the level of innovation in the energy sector and the technologies that are coming through. And the constantly changing proposition of some of the technology providers means that there are always a level of debate and discussion between the lawyers and clients around things like availability guarantees and what people are prepared to offer, because effectively the security of the technologies as they mature is becoming greater and some of the contractual terms are becoming better. But equally, what we're seeing is there is an awful lot of competition in the market, and therefore some contractors are taking a more robust approach to what they're prepared to offer.
Thank you. Okay, so interesting times in there. We really, it's interesting that you are seeing sort of that evolution. Laura, anything to add sort of on the construction side of the documents?
Sure. So I guess a lot of the issues are the same. A lot of the most negotiated points are the same, simply because in order to achieve the results that are needed for the offtake agreements, you need to be considering the same issues and flowing them down to a third party, and including that in the construction document. So that's what you're going to do with your thing, and when do you want to start doing that thing? Well, that's your starting point, and you're flowing it down into your construction contracts. And the tension there is that employers are wanting to cover off as much of their risk as they possibly can in terms of the liquidated damages that Alec talked about, the penalties for late delay in startup, etc. So they're trying to flow it down to the construction contracts or the technology providers. And the technology providers are saying, look, hang on, I said I'd give you this piece of kit and it would do these things, but I'm not here to underwrite your project by way of bankrolling your liquidated damages. So it's you have the argument once in your project docs, and then you have the same argument but from a different angle in your construction contract. So a lot of those issues are the same. I guess there's also construction phase risks which wouldn't have been touched upon, and actually Alec mentioned force majeure, and we do see a lot on force majeure, and you see kind of other allocation of risk for other uncontrollable events, and the flavour of that might change, but the discussions often stay the same. And so, a couple of years ago, it was, what do we do about disruption caused by COVID? That's fallen away a bit more now, and it's about what happens about disruption caused by the events in the Red Sea. And I think the answer is often, the result you come out with is different, but the answer in terms of negotiation is the same, which is engage with the practicalities. What worked 2 years ago in your contract might not work now, because the practicalities of this project and of what's happening in the world are different. Encourage people to work through real life events and examples and think about what might happen, what could the impact be, and what is the fair outcome in terms of how that risk is shared. I think quite often people are talking about these concepts and they haven't really engaged with the practicalities of, in real life, what's it going to mean for this project. And so I think our job is almost to kind of facilitate that thinking a bit further, working out worst case scenarios, and then memorializing whatever is agreed in the contract.
I love that. I love the idea of the fact, for a start, that the evolving nature of these contracts means that we've always got a job. So that's good. It means that the templates aren't going to always work for the client's purposes. All right, then. So we've touched on a little bit of this. I'm really interested. We're seeing an awful lot of change and pressure in the market at the moment, which I assume, and no doubt you'll be able to correct me, I assume that's impacting the risk profiles that we're seeing, and also some of the negotiation dynamics. Again, it might be that we've already touched this in terms of the context, for example, force majeure. But in what ways do you see the market shifts influencing negotiations, and how does this sort of shape your client's approach?
Shall I jump in on that one?
Please do.
So a big thing that we're seeing, or that I'm seeing, and it's kind of started to happen over the last couple of years, is because of this innovation that Alec was talking about, and you've got these new technologies and you've got new ways of using old technologies, and so all sorts of people, it's all been thrown up in the air, and contractors and technology providers are operating in different areas to where they might traditionally have been. And something really interesting that we're seeing coming out of that is that you've got people from oil and gas backgrounds coming into negotiations in the same room as people from renewables backgrounds, and they bring with them these ideas as to what a risk profile should look like and where the red lines are. And I think something that probably everyone is guilty of to a greater or lesser degree is sometimes you haven't examined for some time the reason that you have these red lines or the profile that you're looking for. And so something, as an example, knock for knock indemnities, which they're a really good, neat solution. They make perfect sense in the context of offshore, massive, complex projects with huge risks and outcomes that are completely disproportionate to the value of the contracts perhaps involved. Makes sense in those scenarios. But bring your project onshore and bring in fewer contractors. Think about what the actual, what's the worst that could go wrong on a solar farm. Bringing your oil and gas concepts of risk into negotiations might not be helpful. And I think it's been really interesting. There's shifts on both sides, and it's a great opportunity to take a step back, look at the positions that you've traditionally been adopting in negotiations, and test whether or not they are still the right and relevant and appropriate positions. So I think it's a time of disruption, and that's always is an opportunity to analyze and learn and develop your practice. So it's been really interesting seeing that happen.
Okay, all right. So new players causing us to rethink old methods. All right then. So looking again sort of at risk, we're really keen in terms of the purpose of energy disputes to try and manage risk and look at to mitigate risk from the outset. Can you think of any times where an unforeseen risk has materialised, perhaps during mid-negotiations? And again, the sort of strategies you and your clients have utilised to be able to try and steer your way through it. Don't know if either of you can have got any thoughts on that one.
Not specifically. I think the one thing I would say is that in general at the moment, what we're seeing is, and I alluded to it earlier actually, an awful lot of time being spent on thinking through the proposed changes to the regulatory reforms and how that might impact projects going forward. So a great example is sort of potentially a project in the north of Scotland that otherwise might be economic, but if, for instance, we have nodal or zonal pricing, so a breakdown of the day-ahead electricity price within the UK and any electricity price within the UK to multiple clearing prices across different geographic areas, suddenly it changes the economics of the project quite materially. And that is leading to people to looking at the change in law risk allocation under all contracts to a much greater extent. Now, a lot of these are known as when people go into the contract negotiations, as with the same thing with the technology solution and what can be what is being offered. But what we're finding is that given the constant updates and refinements to what is being proposed, inevitably there is usually a process halfway through the negotiations where everyone looks again at what has been proposed or reformed to try and deal with the issues that are coming out of the ongoing changes. Apologies, that's not an immediately direct response to your question, but I think it alludes to the issues that all of our clients are currently grappling with, which is the flux of change and the rate of change is really quite material, and staying on top of it and trying to address that risk in your contracts to a way that works for you, works for your contractors, and works for potentially limited recourse funders is an increasingly hard task.
Thank you, Alec. I mean, certainly when looking at it from the other end, I mean, the question is sort of very much posed at the purposes of the front end of the contract, the early end. But I suppose when the clients are coming to us then, the dispute lawyers saying, this just isn't working for me, the project economics are no longer there, this doesn't work. We are then, as dispute lawyers, immediately turning to the termination provisions. What are our rights here? What are the opportunities here? What pain are we going to take here? So presumably that is, again, sort of something that you guys at the front end of the drafting, termination provisions are always going to be a key one. Does that sound about right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, lots of nodding there. That's good news. All right then. So most of our clients, and I do say most, not all of them, they're going to prefer to avoid disagreements with their counterparty on their energy projects. I do have the odd few who seem to absolutely revel in the opportunity for a good bust up, but they are very much full and far between. What are the key clauses that you tend to include in your energy project contracts to preemptively address and try to prevent potential disputes down the road? Laura, is that one for you?
Yeah, sure. In the construction contracts, essentially you've got a thing that you want to build, and you've probably got a deadline by which you want to build it. So you just want to flush out the disputes as soon as you possibly can. And I think a lot of what the drafting that we're putting in is there to encourage getting everything out on the table, resolving it and moving on. So there's various kind of early warning obligations. We put in these regular reporting triggers and some kind of level of detail in terms of what is to be reported on. And then there's slightly more, I wouldn't say draconian, I was going to say that, but there's a bit more of a stick as well, which is time bars. Look, if you haven't told us that this thing is happening within a certain amount of time, having discovered it, you're not going to get relief, or the relief that you get is going to be it's going to be reduced according to the delay that you've the delay in reporting. So you're kind of coming at it from both angles to squeeze out the circumstances around the potential dispute. And then you've got this kind of sometimes this soft escalation where you go through senior managers and kind of try and just resolve things practically before it turns into this nuclear option of pressing go on a proper dispute.
I wholly recognise that in terms of what we see at our end. I think one of the really particular points of energy disputes is actually the parties, for the variety of reasons, really don't want to get into a big bust up, and particularly a big bust up, which means the end of the project, either practically or contractually. So those opportunities to avoid that, to build in these triggers, to build in these opportunities to avoid it if at all, or if it is going to happen, then to try and mitigate the impact. I absolutely recognise that from the sort of dispute side.
Yeah, and I think and that it is, you know, when you look at a construction contract, it's for a limited period of time, but then you've got your operation and maintenance contract, most often with the same contractor or a related entity. So you're at the beginning of a 20-year relationship. You don't want to all fall out over an extension of time claim in year one. So yeah, totally.
And I suppose actually just the very nature of the energy projects, it's not unusual to have other contractors based in other jurisdictions, or you're going to have technology, or you're going to have parts, you're going to be coming from various different parts of the world. So again, I mean, I've seen, because of that, probably more of a prevalence for, if they are going to go to a big bust up and proper tribunal, I think the more of the arbitration in terms of the preferred form of dispute resolution. But does that reflect your sort of experience and what you're seeing?
Certainly for me, that's the advice I would give. Is if it's going to have any kind of cross-border element, then I think arbitration makes sense. And parties from different countries are familiar with that and can get comfortable with that. So yeah, that's absolutely. And then Alec and I are quite often comparing notes to try and ensure that the dispute resolution regime has flowed through a whole suite of contracts across a project. But that it has to be its own discussion, I think, on a case-by-case basis.
Which leads me very nicely on to probably my next question then. So do you think parties, and let's be fair, advisors as well, do they give sufficient attention to the dispute resolution provisions? And you can probably guess what answer I want of this as a dispute lawyer.
I think no one wants to think about the worst case scenario, and that will inevitably find itself through the draft, even with lawyers who will be generally have a prevalence to think about the worst case scenario. So I think people do think about it in terms of how they want disputes to work and sort of the escalation process. And also, as Laura was talking about, making sure that there is, to the extent possible, alignment in all of the forums for disputes and governing law. But beyond that, and sort of whether expert determination features or the other processes, I probably agree with you. I think there is a general desire within people to sort of go through it, but not potentially consider all the ramifications of what is being put in the document.
Yeah. Laura, do you second that?
It's not very sexy, is it? Like you can really get stuck into a conversation about like performance warranties and liquidated damages, and I just don't think anyone has any energy left to negotiate and properly discuss the dispute resolution.
This is why they're called the midnight clauses. This is like, oh God, do we really have to go through this? And I suppose that's my big plea. I mean, working through the practicalities, how is this going to work in practice? Is this actually going to resolve your dispute? And also the points that you were touching on earlier in terms of trying to, where necessary, preserve relationships moving forward. If you're going to be stuck with these parties for the next X many years, try and draft your DRP provisions accordingly.
And I think the one thing for me I'll probably add to that is potentially try and keep it simple. We've had a lot of situations where people have proposed sort of dispute resolution clauses which have sort of 5 separate forums for different types of dispute and different types of classification. And I readily understand why that might be appropriate in some instances, but the issue is you then get into satellite litigation around whether the forum is the correct forum for that type of dispute and various other things. And I think speaking particularly to energy projects, as Laura and you were saying, Jess, these are long-lasting relationships where people generally want to get along and make a project succeed, and actually having something that's too complicated for contract managers and everyone to engage with, I think can actually be an impediment to resolving a dispute quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a point that we were touching on earlier. Some of these markets are quite small. Some of these players, you're going to come across each other again. So again, trying to draft your DRP so you can all just get on with the day job. That's got to be the preference. Okay, well, Laura Sharples, Alec Whitehead, thank you both so much for today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's clear, even from this pretty short discussion, that risk mitigation is a key issue really from the very early stages of an energy project, and we should all be thinking of it in that sort of manner. If you'd like to know more about our energy disputes team, or indeed the work that Laura and Alec are doing, you can get in contact via our website. Do look out for our next episode, where we are going to be examining some of the issues which are really specific to energy projects and some of the points that parties need to think about as a result of that. So don't forget to subscribe, and thank you very much for listening.